Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and it is my pleasure, as always, to introduce my co host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you getting on?
Hey, James, hot. I am very hot. But other than hot, I'm good.
Um, I can share the feeling. Um, I'm really looking forward today because we're lucky enough to have on Professor Craig Hassard. Craig is an internationally recognized mindfulness expert. He's a co author of the two top ranked online mindfulness courses. He was the founding president of Meditation Australia, and he's received the Medal of Order of Australia. I hope he won't mind me saying. On top, he is also the author of 13 books, and we are buzzing to have him on. Craig, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Jamie, and hello, Mark. Good to see you again.
Hey, Craig, how's it going? Good to see you too.
Yeah, and now, mind you, when somebody in UK talks about hot, we've got a different idea about that in Australia, so don't complain too much.
That's right, isn't it? Exactly. And we have a different idea of winter, but I guess you really do have a different idea. Is it hot right now in Australia as well?
No, well, it got down to 1 degree this morning on my
Oh,
run. For us, that's really cold.
oh, that's right. It's winter in Australia. Exactly.
Yeah, that's where sort of the weather snobbery I'm allowed to step up and say, 1 degree, you think that's cold? Um, Craig, we're really excited to have you on to talk in part about the role of mindfulness in education. This is something we've discussed on the podcast only extremely briefly, but it's rich and it's juicy. And I wanted to start with stress because one of the main strands of your writing seems to be around the role of stress reduction. Um, so I have sort of two questions. Briefly, why does mindfulness cause that reduction in stress? But mostly, why does that help education outcomes?
Well, it's an important question, Jamie. I think that the first thing is to realize that we do have a stress or a fight or flight response, which is a pretty good and adaptive response, like a turbocharge of energy. When all of a sudden you're eyeball to eyeball with a tiger or a shark or something like that. And so, this activation of the response is to help us to get out of danger from a clearly perceived, present moment threatening situation. So, that activation of the response is actually based on being mindful, being aware that you're in the water and there's the fin of a 4 metre shark and you need to get out of the water. The unfortunate thing is, for every one shark that we do actually see in the present moment, we've probably got about another 999 swimming around in our mind, worrying about what might or might not happen, later today or tomorrow, and what's the traffic going to be like, and I've got to give a talk in a couple of days, and etc., etc., and what are interest rates going to do, and so, or we're reliving things from the past. So we're going back over things, dredging up stuff, replaying arguments we had with people. Oh, why did I decide to do this and not that 20 years ago? And so we're actually generating enormous amounts of stressors in our mind, in our imagination. And the thing is that it might be 3 o'clock in the morning, and present moment reality is that the body's lying on a soft mattress with our head on a soft pillow under some warm blankets and in a very quiet room. So that's present moment reality, but in our mind, we're totally somewhere else.
Yeah,
So the whole
doors locked. You're with your loved one. Doors locked. Clean bed, fed, good water, decent security in your job. I mean, that's high stuff. It's like 1%. Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
so there we are. Present moment reality. That's what it is. But in our mind, we're doing 100 days work before we even get out of bed and so on. So when we're not mindful, the mind's projecting this whole world in our imagination. But if we're not mindful, we also take it to be real, and the body faithfully translates that into the fight or flight response. So all these chemicals are pumping around the system with nowhere to go and nothing useful to do. And that's not a turbocharge of energy. We've got other names for it like anxiety. It's an inappropriate activation of a fantastic response. And that it's not just that the acute activation makes us feel awful and can do things like trigger cardiac events and so on if there's one waiting to happen, but it's actually the long-term cumulative effect of this, of activating it day after day after day, way in excess of what's required, that produces a wear and tear on our system called allostatic load. It's a
Mm.
it'd be like getting a car and driving the car hard the whole time, way harder than it's meant to be driven. And we wonder, why is the car running out of petrol, running out of fuel so quickly? Why are the parts wearing out faster, etc.? And so it's like we do that to the body, and so that has a whole range of health implications, immunological, physiological, neurological, genetic, etc., which are not good for health. So come back to the mindfulness bit. Like there we are, we're standing in our own kitchen, sort of tea bag jiggling in a teacup, making a cup of tea, but in our mind we're fighting with sharks and running from tigers, etc. And coming back to the present moment. Wait a sec, just in my own kitchen, making a cup of tea. So if we come back to the present moment, that stress response will switch itself off because we'll actually see it's got no rhyme or reason to be here. We're preparing for a presentation or an exam, for example. Just come back to paying attention to what's in front of you and get the attention back on the preparation, not catastrophizing about what's going to happen, what if I fail, etc. So it's really reorientating the attention to reality and getting on with that, and not generating all these stressors in our imagination. I hope that sort of gives a bit of a sense of how mindfulness can help, not just mentally and emotionally, but also physically.
So yeah, it seems intuitive that where this might play a role now in education.
Yes, that's right. And so what we need to do is to teach children, university students, these kinds of skills so that for their mental health, and also to help them to focus on the things that they need to focus on in life. Sometimes people say, oh, isn't mindfulness a distraction from your worries? Isn't that all you're doing yourself when you're practicing mindfulness? It's actually the opposite of that. It's the distracted state of mind that is the problem. Mindfulness is the remedy for distraction. But this is a life skill, a really important life skill for children to learn for their own mental health, but also for their ability to function well in life as well.
School and especially university seems like it would be especially challenging for that kind of mind, an untrained mind. One, because it gives you more things to worry about.
Mm.
Yeah, like university can be really hard on students. I mean, like my PhD nearly killed me, and I'm a pretty balanced. I think of myself as a pretty balanced guy, and it's seriously challenging. So you've already got this big allostatic load just from the duress of doing the degree. Now stack that on top of all the sharks that aren't there anyway, that you're just carrying around from your future or carrying around from your past. So you're not going to be as good a student if you're worried all the time. And being a student gives you more to be worried about. So that does seem like a really great place for this sort of intervention. Have you had much, you have experience, Craig, teaching these sorts of things at the university level?
Oh, yes. Well, at Monash University, we've had this as a part of the core curriculum for our medical students since
Wow.
1992 on a small scale.
Wow, is it?
Kind of built up from there in 2002, an expanded program for medical students, and then other health disciplines came on board, so physiotherapy, dietetics, and so on, pharmacy now, engineering. So we have close to 5,000 students at Monash each year who have mindfulness as a part of their curriculum, not as
Wow.
but as a part of their curriculum. And then we have about another close to 2,000 students who do mindfulness training, or run courses, etc., off their own bat. And so, yes, it's very much a part of what we do at Monash. So, and the thing is to contextualize the mindfulness in ways that are relevant for those students. So, dealing with
Right.
workload, um, being able to manage exam anxiety, for their mental health and well-being, to improve, like say for the medical students, being more mindful to enhance communication, to be able to cultivate compassion and avoid empathic, or vicarious stress.
Empathy burnout.
So
Yeah, empathy
for
burnout. Yeah.
pharmacy students to prevent errors, etc. So paying attention, not just being on automatic pilot, which is often when we make errors when we're on automatic
Exactly.
pilot. So it's really contextualizing this one generic skill and making it applicable to those particular health disciplines.
One more question, James, just before you jump in. And do you have any data about how that's been for those students at large? I mean, is it improving their university experience and their career experience? And like, do you have any do you have any good stories about where this really broke through?
Yeah, well, we've published a number of papers. You see, one of the things is when you've got a whole of cohort, intervention like this, it's you don't have an opportunity for a randomized controlled trial because all the students are getting it. So the data
Right.
we've published a number of papers. We look at the students' mental health and well-being, but in a early in the semester when they're in a low stress period, and we find they've got average mental health. Now, there are thousands of studies, for example, with medical students that show that the further they get into the semester, the further they get into the course, the worse their mental health is.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
look at the students after they've had the program, but immediately prior to mid-year exams, we should be seeing a decline in their mental health and well-being, decline
Right.
in their quality of life. But
Yeah.
what we actually find is the opposite of that. After the program, everything we can measure about their mental health and well-being overall as a cohort is significantly better than average. So we're
Wow.
very encouraged by that. We've
Wow.
also seen
Wow.
that it improves their study engagement as well. So the more they engage with mindfulness, the more they engage with their curriculum right across the board.
Wow.
So we haven't had the opportunity to do an RCT because all the students get it. So we can only compare to what the literature has shown that we should be seeing the opposite of what we're seeing. Um, so that's certainly been very encouraging. And from a health professional point of view, the more that students learn about mindfulness and understand it and apply it to themselves, the more likely they are in the future to be recommending this to the patients for dealing with stress or mental health issues or chronic pain, or, so to use it as an adjunct to all of the other medical approaches that might be important for their patients in the future.
To tie this back to stress for a moment, stress is relative to capacity. So, when you're 10 years old, you clearly are doing less difficult work on one level, but you might be doing more difficult work relative to a medical student who's really found their groove by that stage academically. Do you find that stress reduction is something particularly effective for one age group rather than another?
Um, I'm not sure that we could say that. I think it means different things at different ages. What's happening across the board these days is that uh, we're seeing mental health problems, anxiety, depression, in younger age groups. Now, whether it's just being identified more, but I suspect we're actually becoming a society that's breeding more mental health problems at the moment. So rates of depression have been going up for decades. Rates of suicide have been going up as well. So we're not doing everything right as far as I'm not going to suggest that mindfulness is the only thing, but I think it's one of the very important things. But looking at the potential negative impact of the overuse or misuse of social media, for example, is another emerging factor in terms of poor mental health for kids, increased narcissism, etc., unhealthy lifestyle and poor diet, lack of physical activity, lack of connectedness. So there's a whole range of things here. But yeah, so I'm not sure that we can say that it's worse for 10-year-olds. But what I think we do need to do is to help children to develop healthy attitudes and practices and lifestyle and connection and so on from an early age, so we can prevent problems later in life. So I think this kind of education, well-being education, needs to start early and not to get into problems and then all of a sudden start having to use therapies where preventions are often better.
Yeah, because there is this dynamic, right, of prevention versus treatment.
Hmm.
Um, and, every medical professional will say prevention is ideal and treatment is something you do when prevention hasn't worked. So you perceive the well-being practices in education primarily as one rather than the other?
As preventive rather than treatment?
Or vice versa? Or do you instead see it as a tool kind of equally useful for both outcomes?
I think it's important and very useful for both. Um, the thing is that often when people wait till they get very distressed until start thinking about solutions rather than thinking early. I suppose in my own approach to my own well-being, I often say I taught myself mindfulness because as a teenager at school, I realized that if I wandered off into worry about upcoming, big sporting events when I was doing a lot of competitive swimming or off into worrying about exams, how am I going to go at the end of the year? I noticed that I lost focus on what I was doing, which was trying to prepare for those exams. And I created all of this stress. I could feel it in my body and it just didn't feel good. And all of a sudden I realized one day, I'm in a dream world. I'm living a future that hasn't even happened. I'm catastrophizing about things that haven't even happened. And I kind of had this sort of wake up moment that wait a sec, I'm in a dream world much of the time and I don't even realize it. I need to wake up and come back to paying attention to what's in front of me, the things I can actually control. And when I did that, I noticed that stress response just switched itself off. I wasn't trying to relax. I just noticed as soon as I reorientated my attention back to the present moment, I realized I was generating the stress. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. So I started to function better, but I felt better as well. And I used to, in going, you see, stress is much more optional than we realize. We don't realize that we actually have a choice. And so I used to cultivate a calm state of mind. I'm talking about, 16, 17, to take into the exam room. And I was practicing what I would now call mindfulness. That is, just staying in the moment. And I would walk from the train station to school rather than catch the bus, because on the bus everybody's catastrophizing. Oh, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail. And I'd rather just walk, and I would literally smell the roses. I would just walk and I'd feel the sunshine and just walk. And I'd sit outside the exam room and I'd just be present and just stay. And then I can get into the exam room. Now just focus. And exams, I felt really, really calm. I actually quite enjoyed them. They were not a stressful experience, but I cultivated a state of mind to take into that situation. And so that's what the kind of thing that I tried to teach professionals and teachers to help teach their kids. That these kinds of things that we don't have to necessarily experience the amount of stress that we do. But if we don't have the right state of mind, then we're going to multiply stress enormously.
It seems like educators have a fairly unique role here because, number one, they're getting the children or adults, in the case of university, at a very formative age. And the second thing is they are sort of quite often inadvertently, if not the teachers, the setting is a cause of stress. And school and university are therefore seem like a useful opportunity to learn to interface with that, as you described, the exam stress, the catastrophizing on the bus. Is there something you wish was more commonplace at schools and in education to help teach these skills at that vital age?
Yes, I think we need to train the teachers to be more mindful so they can engage better with the students and look after their own mental health better, etc., but also to create a mindful learning environment. Kids are becoming very distracted these days, the overuse and misuse of technology, the enculturation of complex multitasking, which is a complete and utter furphy these days, the kind of distracted, noisy environments the kids are often in, and we wonder why they can't focus very well. So, doing all of that, creating a mindful learning environment, but also when dealing with mental health issues, we don't necessarily expect that teachers are going to be the ones to teach mental health interventions because that's kind of a different skill set. And so, although teaching
Yeah.
basic mindfulness techniques can be very helpful in a learning environment, when talking about managing mental health problems and so on, you need a very experienced mindfulness teacher who understands the principles of things like MBCT, etc. But you need somebody with really good mental health credentials. And you don't want
Yeah.
teachers trying to all of a sudden intervene. Teachers can be supportive in terms of mental health and fostering and encouraging good practices, but But as a mental health intervention, you need somebody with the right skill sets and experience, and not putting all of that burden on the teachers of how to intervene with mental health problems like that. I think that's unfair to put on teachers these days.
Yeah, it's a slightly complex issue, isn't it? That if you're going to teach mindfulness broad spectrum to, let's say, an entire cohort of whatever age, that it's going to be more effective for some personality types and it's going to be less effective for other personality types, and that it might be harmful for people who are struggling with mental illness or extreme stress and distress. That makes it I can imagine it must be really challenging to think of what a good program would look like that would be able to help pick out who's going to be best served by this. And also, or maybe the other way to go about it is you find techniques that are widely beneficial rather than selectively beneficial.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, Mark. And when teaching a whole of cohort approach, so all, like at Monash, about 500 first-year medical students every year have their mindfulness program. And
Right.
and so
Wow.
you've got you've got students with mental health issues and different
Yeah.
personalities,
Sure.
etc. So I think some of the principles in teaching to whole of cohort is that it's always an invitation to explore these practices.
Yeah.
It's core curriculum,
Right.
but you
Right.
engage in the ways that are meaningful for you. You go at your own pace. You only practice what you're comfortable
Right.
to practice. There are only brief practices. We're not
Right.
doing intensive retreats, etc. So just brief practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's the formal and the informal practice of mindfulness. So the sitting mindfulness meditation, invitation to practice that, and a great majority of students, of course, are happy to practice brief practices like that. But we give the students many ways that they can apply mindfulness. So the informal practice of mindfulness, how to be more present when you're studying, when you're walking, when you're driving, when you're eating. So that they can
Yeah.
contextualize it to things that are relevant to them. And a few of the basic cognitive
Yeah.
principles that underpin mindfulness. So it's always just an invitation and never pushing students to go where they're not comfortable to go. What we find is that by the end
Yeah.
in the research we've done, about 90% of the students say that they're using mindfulness outside of the tutorial time in their own life. So 90% of the students say that they're personally using it and applying it. And although it's core curriculum and it's examinable content, we're not going to examine them so you can't pass your first year medicine because you
Yeah.
haven't done enough
Yeah.
mindfulness.
Are you sitting 3 hours non-distracted?
We've been scanning your brain. We're doing a functional MRI today and just going to.
Yeah. Yeah. Your amygdala is still too
That's right. You're
big.
trying to go on to second year. You got to reduce the activity of your amygdala right there. So we can't, but we can expect them to understand the principles of it. And it's up to
Yeah.
them if they want to use it in their own life. But 90% of the students say that they do. And essentially, we're never pushing students to go where they're not comfortable to go. So if they don't want to practice something, then that's totally fine. But the students are virtually always finding ways that they can apply this informally, simply, in practical ways. But I think if students are pushed to practice more than they're comfortable to practice, if they sit down, you will practice, and practicing for long
Yeah.
periods of time, then there's a lot more potential to bring up adverse events and cause problems and struggles and so on. But we've actually not struck that, I think, because of the way that we've gone about
Yeah.
teaching it.
Wow. It sounds like an incredibly mature, such a wonderful way to build a bespoke course. You start it with compassion and patience and ease, and then you build it around the skills that the students need. It sounds
Yeah.
great.
And so, for example, in other parts of the curriculum, say for the medical students, or they're learning about, say, communication skills. And so you link the mindfulness with communication skills. And so, what are you noticing about when somebody's speaking? Where's your attention then? What does it mean to be mindful while communicating, to really be listening, etc.? So this is linked to, where's your attention when you're doing your first venipuncture, like trying to put a sharp needle into
Yeah.
somebody's vein to draw blood, because they'll notice that their attention's either on the procedure they're doing, or their attention is on, oh no, this is terrible, I'm going to stuff up, and what if I do? And so you help them to manage the waves of tension. It's okay, just observe, standing back from the anxiety, but to engage your attention with the tactile experience, the sensory experience of what you're doing. So we contextualize this in very practical ways that are meaningful and relevant for the students, and they kind of get it.
Are many universities doing this sort of thing, Craig? Is this increasingly popular, or is Monash a bit of a special place? Because I mean, I've never seen in my experience of university life a place where you have mindfulness as a core curriculum that's sort of growing out like good yeast throughout all the departments. I haven't seen that
Um,
very often. Is it pretty common
we're the
or
first in the world to bring it,
yeah,
and uh,
exactly.
and and
Wow.
I haven't got survey data to back this up, but I suspect we've got the most broad um, delivery of mindfulness across the university environment. I mean, apart from the number of staff that have had an interest in this. Um, but other places that are very noted for Ron Epstein's work, Rochester University, so they were bringing it in, but later on in the course, and bringing it in to improve decision making, diagnostic skills, communication, and so on. So they're bringing it in late in the course, and we're bringing it in much earlier in the course, but in a kind of a way, you know, the skills we're teaching in self care and communication and so on very much link in and form a foundation for the kinds of things that Ron Epstein has been teaching for many years now at Rochester in the States. So but there are a few universities, and I've worked with a few around the world, helping them, and in Australia as well, to develop this kind of curriculum. So it's happening in more places these days, which is great because I think it's a basic life skill.
I'm interested in
Wow.
the specifics here around medical students because when you were describing the needle going into the heart, I see why there might be
Not
kind
in
of
the heart, into vein.
into the
into
vein apologies. But nonetheless, I mean, I can see why that.
You'd have to be really mindful to get the needle into the heart. Then it's a
Yes,
really
that's a very
important
advanced skill.
procedure.
We're not teaching that yet.
Um, but I can see nonetheless why medical students might be faced with environments that are stressful, in a very sort of
Yeah.
superficially obvious way. That's not to say other degrees clearly can be unbelievably stressful, but you know, you're dealing with human beings, etc. Do you find medical students are disproportionately, or do you perceive that something like medicine, where you're interacting with other human beings and building relationships, is particularly well suited for mindfulness?
Oh, I think so. Look, for me, um, when I was kind of teaching myself mindfulness, there were so many ways in which being present, paying attention, and so on was relevant to the work as a doctor. And so, before mindfulness was a word, that was being widely used. When I came to teaching in medicine, there were thousands of ways of making this relevant for the students that I was thinking about. So, um, and like, for example, doing that procedure, having your attention where it needs to be is not only good for managing your own anxiety, but actually being able to successfully do it, to communicate effectively. That when doing very long shifts, you know, you could be working all day and all night, all
Yeah.
day, all night. They don't have those kinds of shifts these days. But I recognize that in that kind of environment, in the middle of the night, you've been going for 48 hours or more, and you've got a 2-minute walk from one ward to another. I realized that was 2 minutes of downtime. It's a mental downtime. There's nothing more complicated happening now than just walking from point A to point B. So giving 2 minutes of mental rest, 2 minutes of mental space, and then getting to the next situation and paying attention to the complex clinical situation you need to pay attention to. So one thing at a time, one job at a time, one moment at a time. And that conserves an enormous amount of energy. So this sort of contextualizing it to the kind of work the students will be doing, the kinds of skills they need to develop your attention, your ability to be present, and also to cultivate the attitude of openness, of self-compassion, etc., so that both for our mental health, but also to be able to function well. So these are really core skills, I think, ideally adapted to medicine, but also to many other careers. It's the same skills, but like for a teacher in the classroom, to be present, attentive to the children, decision making, planning, preparation. So pharmacy, engineering, problem solving skills, etc. So there are so many different ways that this one generic thing has particular applications.
I am really struck by, I've been practicing meditation for 20 something years. And when you just described what it was like to be a doctor in such high stakes, high stress environment, it sounds like almost the perfect training ground for really learning how important and to be able to switch, because it really matters for you there. It really mattered. You had to learn how to just be able to drop what wasn't immediately present and be present if you were going to be okay. And I would have thought that was a terrible situation to learn these sorts of things, but there you go. Like, think about the reframing in that you could take a really challenging situation and it may turn out to be ideal in some ways to really learn some of these skills. That's a remarkable thing to hear. I mean, I really hear it when you said it, that like you had to. You've got 2 minutes. You've been up for 48 hours. You have to conserve energy. That means you can't be at the next patient or the last patient for this 2 minutes, or else you're not going to get through the day. You have to literally just be with the walking and be in a relaxed state, even though you've just been high stress and you're about to be in high stress. That's remarkable.
Well, for me, it was the only sense. And like, when you had your 50-hour working week, Monday to Friday, but a weekend on as well in between, for my roster was early Saturday morning to late Monday night. So it was a 64-hour shift without sleep. It's like, and you get a few hours sleep and you turn up for the Tuesday morning ward round next morning. Anyway, but I kind of, for some reason, I thought to myself, do an experiment. See what's possible in terms of conserving energy and being able to focus. And you can only focus on one thing at a time. I had a pad with a whole lot of things to do all written down, but just one priority at a time, one moment at a time, one step at a time. And so I didn't realize what I was doing, but I was kind of practicing being mindful. I didn't have the language for it. But those kinds of experiences, doing my first lumbar puncture, and you got a long needle and you're putting it into somebody's spinal, and you kind of, and I realized, got to have the attention right on what's happening, paying attention, feeling the needle, the sensation, because that's giving you the information to be able to do the procedure. Because if your attention's on, oh, this is awful, why am I doing this? Am I in the wrong career? I don't know, I'm going to kill somebody. Is it possible to kill somebody doing a lumbar puncture? It's like, it's not going to be helpful. So for me, stepping into training the students, I was drawing on that kind of experience. And then, of course, over, this was going back in the early, into the late 80s when started to sort of get involved in medical education. But as the mindfulness things started to take off in the late 90s and 2000s and so on, all of a sudden there was a language around this. There was much more of a science around this. And that was very helpful in expanding this kind of work. And all of a sudden you're drawing on work that's happening at the same time all around the world. So it's really got an enormous amount of momentum now. And there's this sort of cross-pollination, if you like, of different skill sets and knowledges and so on that are really very helpful. And I don't think the work at Monash would have expanded so much if it wasn't also building on all the fantastic work that's going on in so many other parts of the world. It's really helped what we've been doing enormously.
Yeah, so one thing you mentioned there was sort of about the mental flexibility. And when I was doing some research for this podcast, the relationship between mindfulness and mental flexibility came up a couple of times. And I wanted to know what you meant exactly by mental flexibility.
In some of the studies, they talk about this cognitive rigidity, for example, coming up and trying to deal with a problem and using a method maybe that worked for some of the easy problems, but as the problems get harder, keep using the same way of trying to solve the problem. And even when it's not working, still hammering away like beating your head against a brick wall. And so mental flexibility kind of, if the method of solving the problem is not working, to be able to stand back, to look again, to look at it laterally, to maybe look at a different option, to experiment with something different. So this sort of mental flexibility, not so attached to our assumptions about how this problem has to be approached. So it's the ability to stand back, look objectively, non-attachment to the ideas and assumptions that we're making, to give a person an opportunity to look again, to see something maybe they weren't seeing, to try a different approach. And that's a very useful kind of thing. I think one of the big stressors for clinicians, for example, is dealing with ambiguity. You think, oh, well, there's one problem, there's one answer, and it's all in a textbook, and I've learned it, and life's just not like that. And so the ability to deal with ambiguity is a really important, just from a well-being point of view, but also from a mental flexibility point of view. The other things, like on a higher cognitive level, dealing with biases, and often biases influence diagnostic or decision-making ability. We come to problems with a whole bunch of biases that we don't even know that we've got, a whole lot of limitations in our thinking.
Yeah.
This is the way that it is, and this is the way everybody talks about it, etc. And we don't really look. We kind of look through all these filters, and it's not like, well, I've done a bit of mindfulness, I don't have biases anymore. It's more a matter of, I've done a bit of mindfulness, and I'm starting to become aware of how many biases there are that are actually quite unconscious, that I'm not normally noticing. So you're a general practitioner, it's the middle of winter, and a child comes in with a low-grade fever, and in the back of the mind, oh, it's another child with a cold. And you've already made an assumption before you've assessed the child. Now, if we're mindful, the child comes in,
Wow.
oh, it's another child with a cold. Oh, wait a sec. I'm making an assumption before I've even assessed the child. And so there's an ability to self-correct. Don't take an assumption to be a fact. It might be another child with a cold, but this could be the 1 in 100 children who's got pneumonia, or has got the very early stages of meningitis, or something else that you don't want to miss. But if we're operating on the assumption, the unconscious assumption, that a bias is a fact, then we don't assess what's really in front of us. We see what we expect to see, and we don't see anything else that sort of sits outside of that. So that kind of mental flexibility is an ability to respond to what's actually there, to assess things on their merits better. And so this allows an ability to not just head down like this line of thinking, but to actually adjust when we need to adjust. So these are very important skills to have, and they're very high level skills that, for training professionals are much better learnt later on in the course, using those early skills and sort of to take it to the next level. Because these are very important skills for professionals to have, I think.
The fact that we have skills, the fact that we can develop that we have ways, that we know that there are techniques and ways of improving exactly that kind of skillfulness. And just your description there of how it applies to medicine makes it feel like an absolute no-brainer. I can't believe not everyone is training in that, because not only do doctors need that, but everybody needs that right now, to be able to drop your assumption and actually see what's happening right in front of you.
And it doesn't mean that assumption's necessarily wrong, but there's an ability to test it. There's an ability to question it if we're awake. But if we're just on automatic pilot, we just take it to be assumption to be a fact, and we never question it. And there's all sorts of other things we don't see that don't fit in with that assumption.
It strikes me that questioning your assumptions is, as you say, quite a high-level cognitive play. But one that has many benefits, including problem solving. Just to tie that piece together, it's quite obvious that you can bang your heads against a problem for a huge period of time while making intelligent internal leaps, taking your base assumptions and not being callous, being thoughtful. But if you're starting with the wrong assumptions, You're going to have a difficult time getting to the right answers, and that's particularly high stakes in the medical context.
Mm. Well, that's right. And diagnostic, clinical errors, etc. These things have important implications for patients, but also for the professional themselves, because these errors, I've not met doctors or medical students, training, or other health professionals or other professionals that want to do a bad job or are keen on harming a patient. It's the most gut-wrenching thing for doctors that I know. And for myself, ever the thought that you've harmed a patient. It's an awful feeling, because that's the last thing in the world that you want to do. But we're all human. We all have our moments. I think one of the important things about being mindful is that it makes it easier to learn from experience, to turn towards those difficult experiences and to learn something from them, rather than just to beat ourselves up about them. And so we need to look back and learn from a past experience, but move forward attentively with awareness. But it's this is, I think, just a really important capacity to develop, and I think to learn and have that self-compassion, and to do what we can to prevent these errors. But we have to have the awareness. If we're on automatic pilot, not really paying attention, then we're not even aware of what we're missing, and it makes these errors much more likely to happen.
I'm wondering here, just to throw it back to sort of education itself, um, what we're commonly doing. I'm interested in the misconceptions around what is good practice in teaching that sort of this mindfulness lens um, disagrees with. This mindfulness lens says, actually, we'd be more effective in doing something different. What common practices would you like to see reformed?
You mean in the classroom?
Mm.
Um, uh, well, I think more mindful communication, better listening is very important between children, teachers, children, university. I think communication is one important area. The ability to develop emotional regulation, I think, is pretty good, and is not something that's happening too well. I think part of a mindful environment, I think technology is a wonderful thing, and I often say it can be it's a wonderful servant, but it's a tyrannical master. And I think that we're
Mm.
misusing a lot of technology, and in the classroom, often replacing real experiences with virtual ones. So I think that
Mm.
never, from an educational point of view, replace uh, potential real experiences with virtual ones. And so there's quite a lot of research, starting to show that too much screen time is actually has a detrimental effect and degrades attention,
Yeah.
ability to focus. Too many notifications, a noisy, distracted kind of environment. So I think from an educational point of view, we need to create better environments for children to learn in and to use the technology in a more discerning way. Um, so there's all sorts of interesting things like reading from a screen compared to reading from hard copy. And reviews of the literature show that children take in more uh, and have a better sense of how well they're reading, how accurately they're reading when they're reading from hard copy rather than from screens. I'm not sure we know all the reasons for that, but also taking notes and typing notes compared to writing notes. Students will understand and take in more when they're writing notes rather than typing notes. Probably because you can't write quite as quickly,
Mm.
so you've actually got to um, sort of connect with the content more and summarize it and distill it out in your mind more. So you're interacting with the material more if you're writing notes than if you're typing them, rather than just trying to type verbatim. So there's all sorts of things that we've holus bolus sort of taken on board technology and assumed it's going to be better, rather than just using it in targeted ways where it might be more useful. And things like rote learning. I'm not sure we need to have children in there just rote learning things all the time, but children aren't using their memory. in the way that they might have previously. And one interesting review paper was looking at the impact of the online world on the human brain. And one of the areas of the brain that's suffering these days is memory, because we don't use it, because we don't have to. It's all on, just got to Google it, and just got to, don't have to remember all those phone numbers you used to have to remember, and you don't have to remember how to get from point A to point B because the GPS will tell you. So there's a lot of ways in which developmentally, from an attentional point of view, memory point of view, etc., that children are kind of living more and more in a virtual world and less in a connected world. We're connected with a sensory world, getting out and experiencing the environment, etc., and getting outdoors. In schools, for example, that take this on board and say, oh, no, lunchtime, playtime, screen-free time, so that children are much more physically active. They communicate, engage with each other much more rather than just sitting around texting each other in the playground, etc., which is what happens when kids have got their screens in front of them the whole time. So I think that there's a number of things where the modern world, we need to use it in a mindful kind of way. So these are some of the things that I suggest to schools, to teachers, and to try and sort of give some of the data, but also some practical skills in how to do that.
Craig, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
No, it's been a real pleasure, Jamie. Thank you, and thank you, Mark.
That was the
Yeah, thanks,
Contemplative
Craig. It
Science
was a treat.
podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, we'll be back next week.